doing so, 4, Americans get higher gas prices and no increased energy security. 5, TransCanada, Hugo Chavez, and the sheikhs of Saudi Arabia laugh all the way to the bank. Please vote yes for the Markey, Connolly, Cohen, Welsh.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you. This amendment just defies logic in the sense that the refined product of gasoline is going to be used in the United States. Now, the fallacy of this amendment here is it says all of the refined products. Well, there's stuff that's left over after the process that we can't even use in the United States that's commonly exported today for decades. We actually don't use all of the diesel, and we trade with Europe to bring in more gasoline. So what this amendment is trying to do is, A, start a trade war because it violates all trade rules and regulations. But the reality is it's a misnomer. If you really want this oil to go to China and us to have to continue to import from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, then vote yes on this amendment, because evidently you're more concerned about jobs in China than you are in the United States. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request the ayes and nays.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a bill at the desk, an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, why is it that the proponents of this bill is walking around this Capitol smiling and smirking? Well, it's because this bill requires the hasty approval of an unprecedented permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. They're smiling and smirking because their friends, the big oil companies, are big winners with this bill, while the little people, the private property owners, along the path of the proposed Keystone XL pipeline will be the big losers. Mr. Speaker, people might be surprised to learn that TransCanada has been bullying American people, American landowners, and pressuring them to allow the company to build a pipeline through their land. In fact, during the subcommittee hearing, we heard testimony from witnesses who live along the path near the proposed route of this pipeline that TransCanada is doing just that, bullying them. They don't even have a permit to build the pipeline, yet we are told that they are threatening American citizens with eminent domain, basically telling people, if you don't give us access to your land, if you don't give us your land, then we're going to take it. Mr. Speaker, this is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. Why are we rewarding a private foreign company that is trying to intimidate and coerce American citizens with this regulatory earmark in order to protect private owners, Mr. Speaker, along the path of this pipeline? I'm offering an amendment that will restrict the use of eminent domain. My amendment requires that a permit for this pipeline will only be used if it prohibits the use of eminent domain to take someone's private property against their will. Well, Mr. Speaker, my office was in contact with a Nebraska rancher by the name of Randy Thompson, who wrote me a letter dated February 9th, And I want to read an excerpt for my colleagues to consider, and I quote Mr. Thompson. He said, "Dear Congressman Rush, I would like to express to you, sir, my concerns about the bill introduced by Representative Terry to fast forward the permitting process for the Keystone XL pipeline. It seems inherently wrong to me that a foreign corporation can actually force American citizens to forfeit their individual property rights through the use of eminent domain. With the denial of a permit, TransCanada has, for the time being, suspended their land acquisition process in the state of Nebraska. I can assure you, however, that they will be back on our doorsteps with a vengeance once a new route has been determined and a permit has been granted. It appears to me that some members of Congress are too eager to subsidize the big oil companies, not only with our tax dollars, but now with land that belongs to American citizens. Mr. Speaker, we have a right to protect our citizens from being bullied into giving up their land against their will for the gain of private foreign company. Mr. Speaker, let us wipe the smile and the smirk off the face of the proponents of this bill, pass this amendment, protect the American people.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek
Rise
recognition?
to claim the time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, none of us are smiling over the fact that the President killed the pipeline that would have created 20,000 jobs and provided us a newer level of energy security. And this amendment, in essence, is a way of killing this pipeline. Let's be clear about this. The pipeline is 1,700 miles. And in each state that this passes, this pipeline, proposed pipeline would pass, the oil company, or the pipeline company, excuse me, negotiates with the landowners on the proposed route. So, if you have one person that objects, then they can ostensibly kill the pipeline. So in every state, there is a mechanism in its own state laws that resolves any disputes for a right-of-way. And we've heard some language here about taking people's property. This is for use of a property and a right-of-way, a small strip of land, okay? So their rights are protected. The state's rights are protected. What this amendment would do is strip the states of their rights here and send it off to an unknown area that has no rights to resolve any disputes. And they only need one landowner to kill a 1,700-mile project. The gentleman's letter that the gentleman from Chicago mentioned is one of those people. He belongs to Bold, Nebraska, an organization of environmentalists to kill the pipeline. And at this point, I'd yield my remaining time to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker. Thank the gentleman from Nebraska for yielding. I'm actually here to speak on Mr. Markey's amendment, the previous amendment. I want to oppose my good friend from Chicago, Mr. Rush's amendment, but I think Mr. Terry eloquently made the case why it's not in order at this point in time. But I want to go back to the previous amendment that Mr. Markey offered to restrict the use of oil, both crude oil and refined products that come in through the Keystone Pipeline, to have to be sold in the United States. It goes without saying that if it's crude oil, it would make absolutely no sense to transship it through the Keystone Pipeline to the Gulf Coast and then put it in a tanker to go overseas. If you're going to export crude oil, it makes much more sense to export it directly from Canada. On the refined product end of it, you have to know one thing, that this crude oil that we would be importing from Canada is a heavy crude oil. We have some of the best refineries in the country that have been upgraded by billions and billions of dollars so that we can handle not just the light sweet crudes like West Texas Intermediate or Saudi Light, but we can handle these heavy crudes like the Canadian crude oil that would come down. And when you have a barrel of crude oil, you can't just say, I want to make it all gasoline. You can make a lot of gasoline, but you're going to end up having to make diesel oil and asphalt and a lot of other products. And our refineries are the best in the world at cracking these heavy crudes. As they come down through the Midwest to the Louisiana and Texas refineries, most of the refined products would be sold in the United States. But the United States is primarily a gasoline market. The European market, on the other hand, is primarily a diesel market. So as our refineries have become better and more competitive, it makes sense to not put a restriction on the refined products, but let the market allocate it. It would actually create jobs in the United States. We could ship some of these refined, primarily diesel, but some of the distillates could go to the European market. You get a better margin, create jobs, protect jobs here in the United States. The primary market will always be the United States. Currently, about 75% of the crude oil that's refined on the Gulf Coast is used in refined products that are sold in the United States. But somewhere around 20 to 25% has been going to Europe, primarily the distillates and the diesel. The Markey Amendment would turn that market on its head. It would be counterproductive to our economy, counterproductive to our consumers, and counterproductive to the general oil markets in the world. So I know Mr. Markey has, is trying to do what he thinks is the right thing, but in actuality, if we passed his amendment, which we defeated in the committee, I think 34 to 14 or something like this, we got 8 Democrats, about 40% of the Democrats, to vote with us against the Markey Amendment in committee. We ought to defeat it by that same margin here on the floor of the House of Representatives. I want to thank Mr. Terry for yielding. I also want to thank Mr. Whitfield for his excellent leadership on this issue.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to inquire how much time do I have
The gentleman
remaining?
from Illinois has 1 minute remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me just say, we as members of this Congress, we were elected to this body to protect the American people, to protect our citizens, to protect their property. And Mr. Speaker, this action that's occurring by the Republican majority is going to pass. But it's also going to throw that responsibility, that obligation, the reason for our existence here in this Congress, is going to turn it upside down. It's going to make it just meaningless, the protection of the American people. Why don't you protect the landowners,
Will the
the
gentleman
private
yield so I can
landowners
answer the question?
in your state?
The answer to that question would be that each state has set up its due process laws, and it's much better for each one of the members of those states to be able to.
In our nation, we're elected here to protect them and not turn their land over, let big oil companies, Keystone and TransCanada, or foreign company, come in and just take
They don't
their
take.
land.
They don't take. There's a legal process set up in a state, and the only thing you're taking away is the state's rights, the 10th Amendment.
The gentleman from Nebraska will suspend. The gentleman from Illinois' time has expired. Chair would ask members not to interject during comments from another member. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor will say aye. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Roll call vote.
The gentleman from Illinois requests a roll call. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Speaker.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 4, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will take as much time as I can consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, despite all the controversy surrounding this pipeline, I think this is a good opportunity for us to examine some of the claims that the applicant for the Keystone XL pipeline has made. Now, let me say at the onset, I support building this pipeline in a way that protects the environment and helps create American jobs. I don't support the rush 30-day manner that this bill would have us do, but I do support the pipeline. When I started reading about the 800,000 tons of steel to be used in the Keystone XL pipeline, like everyone else, I was pretty excited about the prospects for our U.S. manufacturers, and especially coming from Pittsburgh, our steel manufacturers. So I have to tell you, I was a little confused when I talked to my friends in the U.S. steel industry, and they told me they weren't making any of the steel for this project. Now, I knew this had to be a mistake because TransCanada had told us that there would be 7,000 direct manufacturing jobs created by this project, so surely someone somewhere in the United States has to know what these jobs are. I've also heard folks talking about the wonderful jobs being created at steel mills in southwestern Pennsylvania. Trouble is, I can't find a steel mill in southwestern Pennsylvania that's making steel for the Keystone XL pipeline. In fact, I'm having trouble finding a single U.S. steelmaker that has any orders for any of this pipe. Now, I reached out to the permit applicant, TransCanada, and several other sources for some clarifying information regarding their claim that 75% of the steel used in the Keystone XL pipeline will be sourced from North America. Unfortunately, the best I seem to get is that there's a single pipe manufacturer in Little Rock, Arkansas, that is providing much of the steel pipe for the pipeline. The trouble is, that manufacturer doesn't actually use U.S. or North American steel to make the pipe. In fact, the Little Rock plant very clearly told me that they make their pipe out of foreign steel imports. They also told me they have imported and are housing on their site 140 miles of ready-made pipe that they got from India to be used in the Keystone pipeline. So, all my amendment does is ask for some truth in advertising. TransCanada has told us that they make every effort to source as much steel from U.S. mills as they can. I'm simply asking the applicant to certify their claims. Along with other members of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I have sent a letter to TransCanada asking for this information, but I've yet to receive a response. I think members deserve this information. If there is, in fact, a U.S. steelmaker out there that is making all or some of the steel for the Keystone XL pipeline, I think we have a right to know about it. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For purposes the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I seek recognition to oppose the amendment.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself 3 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, I would like to say to the gentleman of Pennsylvania who's a very hard-working member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and provides great leadership, that we reluctantly oppose his amendment. His amendment is very simple, and it is very direct. It simply says the permit will not be issued until the permit applicant certifies and provides adequate documentation that at least 75% of the iron and steel used in the construction of the pipeline is produced in North America, which is a goal that many of us have. Now, I'd like to point out a couple of facts here. Number one, this is a private company that's putting up $7 billion of its own money. Number two, in order to keep costs down, it's already acquired all of the steel and iron that's going to use in this pipeline. Now, some people say, well, why in the world would it spend over $2 billion buying this material when they didn't have a permit? Well, they filed this permit 40 months ago, and all of the information coming out from the Secretary of State, the Department of State, in their final environmental impact statement would indicate that the pipeline was going to be approved. So they bought this material many months ago to try to keep costs down. And I would tell you that from the information that we have, 74% of the pipe was milled here in North America. And in fact, it's milled in 4 different locations. Not all of them are in North America. The steel comes from 7 different sources, some of it from America and some of it not from America. But the reality is that if we adopted this amendment, the permit would not be issued because the applicant cannot certify that 75% comes from America because it bought this material a long time ago. And I might add, there's not one dime of taxpayer money in this project. So our feeling is that the practical aspects that you would basically stop the building of this pipeline, we would lose all those jobs, we would lose all the additional oil that we would be getting, and we believe that there would be more negatives from it than there would be positives. And one other comment that I would make is that the American Iron and Steel Institute, that represents many of the companies that Mr. Doyle is concerned about, is supporting our legislation. We have the letter that they support this legislation and they support building the pipeline. And I might also say that 5 of the major labor unions in America, I yield myself an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
5 of the major labor unions in America support this legislation because they recognize the additional jobs that will be available to them in the construction of the pipeline. So for that reason, we reluctantly oppose Mr. Doyle's amendment, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
The gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, and I thank you, Mr. Doyle, for your leadership. This is a great amendment. It's a common-sense amendment. Now, we don't know if the XL pipeline will be built, and many have strong opinions on whether or not it should be built at all. But one thing that we should all agree on is that if it is built, it should be built with materials made right here in America. You see, when we talk about producing energy in America, that doesn't just mean oil, gas, wind, nuclear, and other sources that power our homes and businesses. It means materials used to extract, refine, and transport that energy. And why does it have to happen that it needs to be American-made materials? Because it means jobs, good-paying jobs that can help to strengthen our middle class. It means stronger communities and a stronger economy at a time when we need that now more than ever. And it means a future with more security and more certainty for the next generation. This pipeline is going to run through America. It should be made of American iron, steel, and manufactured goods. I ask all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this common-sense amendment, in supporting the American middle class, and in supporting American jobs.
The gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I reserve the balance.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
The gentleman from Pennsylvania has 1 minute remaining.
I'd like to yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I stand and I support the Keystone Pipeline, but I found out this last Monday, and I've asked, I know our chair of our Energy Committee has heard me ask about a project labor agreement that's for the whole part of the pipeline, but it doesn't cover Texas. The largest state in the Union does not have a project labor agreement, TransCanada. I consider TransCanada maybe didn't deceive me, but they sure didn't answer the questions when I asked them in our committee. And I've talked to them about that, and I know our labor support nationwide, but they have a project labor agreement from the Canadian border to the Oklahoma border, but not for the biggest part of it in the state of Texas, and I'm going to work with them to see, because it's important that that job be done safely.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have 30 seconds left. Is that correct?
Gentleman's correct.
Yeah, I'll use the rest of my time. Mr. Speaker, my good friend from Kentucky, and he is my good friend, more or less has just said that the amendment can't go through because it's impossible for TransCanada to certify what they said was true. They've misled us. I think we ought to just be honest with the American people. It's obvious from the discussion today and from past discussion that this steel is not being manufactured in North America. It may be finished in North America at some of these plants, but no steel was made in North America. Congress has been misled. This is not a way for a company to do business. They're a private company. They can use anybody they want. What they can't do is lie to Congress. Mr. Speaker, I yield back and I ask for a yes vote.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
How much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman from Kentucky has 1.5 minutes remaining.
I might just reiterate once again, this is a private company spending $7 billion of their own money. Before any of this ever became an issue, they acquired this material. They spent over $2 billion acquiring this material. Everyone's talking about jobs, and one of the reasons they're offering this amendment is because of jobs. Well, there's nothing we can do about the material already being acquired. It's already purchased. So all we would do if we pass this amendment is we would make sure that the permit for this pipeline would not be issued. This material, all this $2 billion worth of steel would be moved to Canada. They would build the pipeline to the West Coast and move all the oil to China, and they would get the construction jobs, so we would end up with no jobs. So I know the gentleman's intentions are the very best, and we all are concerned about the issue, but there are no taxpayer dollars involved in this. It's a private company. They've already acquired this material. This never did become an issue until, I suppose, about a month ago, and the material was even acquired at that point. So I would respectfully request that members oppose this amendment. Let's build this pipeline, and let's help America be less dependent upon foreign oil. And I yield back and balance my time.
All time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. What purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 5, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed each shall control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My amendment gets to the heart of what sustains our western communities from Colorado to California to New Mexico to Montana, our water and our land. My amendment is the answer to concerns from my constituents in Colorado, outcries from farmers, from ranchers, local communities, from sportsmen, from recreationists, and from many others who know that this bill threatens their livelihoods, and my amendment corrects that component. Mr. Speaker, this bill contains a troubling oil shale provision. Now, it was originally included to help pay for the bill's overall cost, but it was found to provide no revenue. So how can something help pay for a bill when it provides no revenue? While the CBO's score confirms it receives no revenue, there's therefore no reason to include it. We might as well simply take up any random natural resources bill. And in fact, the whole discussion of oil shale certainly deserves its own discussion. And since it's not going to help pay for our highways, I would urge my colleagues, even if they're supportive of this end product, to remove this from this bill. Let me be clear, my amendment has nothing to do with one form of energy over another. You'll probably hear people on both sides of this argument talk about the potential for oil shale in the future. It's not about dirty or clean forms of energy. It's simply about common sense. If a technology doesn't exist and it won't bring in revenue, why is it being considered as a revenue provision for an unrelated infrastructure bill? We've all heard of former presidential candidate Herman Cain's 999 plan, but the oil shale section of this bill is a 000 plan. No revenue, no jobs, and no energy. it mandates we lock up land at fire sale prices to those who are connected enough to make bids for a technology that doesn't even exist, and would threaten jobs, would threaten water in western Colorado, and threaten our western way of life. My amendment simply strikes that section, leaving revenue for the overall bill unaffected, and keeps our western lands and waters as they currently are, outside of what's supposed to be an infrastructure and transportation bill. Now, you might hear some hold up Estonia as an example of oil shale development, but by all accounts, Estonian oil shale has been an economic disaster. Even Jim Bartas with the RAND Corporation said that, to our knowledge, oil shale in Estonia is not even used to produce transportation fuels. You'll also hear that we're the Saudi Arabia of various energy resources. Now, I continue to question the wisdom in looking to Estonia and Saudi Arabia for leadership and energy independence for our country. Even industry insiders know that a provision like the one contained in this bill is simply the wrong thing to do. Jeremy Boak, a professor who heads the industry-sponsored Center for Oil Shale Technology at the Colorado School of Mines, said that he's doubtful that any firm would even bid on commercial leases, leaving them to speculators. He also said, it isn't obvious to me yet that we need to be putting a bunch of commercial leases out there because no one has a commercial process yet. That's something that industry admits. There's no feasible, cost-effective commercial process for extracting oil from shale. We're talking about a potential technology, one that will have profound implications on water, profound implications on land use, and yes, profound implications on national energy policy. But it's a technology that doesn't exist. This component of the bill, if we don't remove it, will simply remove speculators rather than those who can actually play a meaningful role in providing for our energy-independent future. I strongly encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this common-sense amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, reserves. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. It would strike a key provision of the bill that would provide American jobs and tap into a potential natural resource, American oil shale. This amendment also increases the federal take from drilling in ANWR from 50 to 51%, leaving the state of Alaska with that much less. Now, proponents of this amendment will argue that we should get rid of the oil shale provisions because the technology is not proven. Estonia does get a sizable amount of energy from oil shale currently. And I'd like to ask, why is the proponent of this amendment so concerned that this is going to be a big thing in the future and affect the Western way of life if he thinks it's never going to take off and amount to anything? You know, he can't have it both ways. So why don't we let the companies experiment on their own expense, on their own dime, and see if they can find a commercial viable process that works to extract this hugely potential source of energy. The USGS has estimated that there are 1.5 trillion, with a T, barrels of oil equivalent in these oil shale formations. I think it's worth at least experimenting to see if it can be commercially extracted, because that would be a huge relief from having to get foreign oil. And it would create money for the treasuries of states and the federal government and create American jobs, as well as the security aspect. So I just don't see why there's such opposition to this when they say it's not going to work. That just doesn't make sense. They can't have it both ways. I say let the companies experiment at their own expense, no cost to the taxpayer. And so I strongly urge opposition to this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, reserves. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps my friend and colleague from Colorado isn't aware that there already is extensive experimentation about the potential for oil shale to meet our energy needs. In fact, there are millions of dollars spent every year in research that industry itself has invested in this technology. Furthermore, there's 3 million acres of oil shale lands in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming that are under state, private, or tribal leadership and have for decades. In fact, several large companies alone already control 200,000 acres of oil shale lands. There's a couple sites in Colorado where they're looking to try to develop cost-effective methods. In fact, by the end of 2012, there'll be 9 active federal research and development leases. No one has figured out a cost-effective way to develop these areas. Again, this is not about the research. In fact, the second round of bids in early 2009, when the Obama administration affirmed the Bush administration's decision regarding a second round of R&D leasing, there was a significant reduction in industry bids. Industry itself was even less interested in trying to figure out this, because it's been a nut that they've been able to crack for nearly 100 years. This amendment is not about the environment, it's about common sense. Mr. Speaker, I inquire how much time remains?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Well, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to strongly support this common sense amendment to preserve our land, our jobs, and our water in the West. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would just like to point out that this is one more example of the Obama administration stifling the production of domestic energy in this country. They put out restrictive regulations that made it so untenable for commercial companies to even go into the research and development leases as it was changed after President Obama took office, that there was little interest in pursuing under the new format. So we need to go back to the previous way of offering these leases so there is at least interest on the part of industry at their own expense to see if this technology is commercially viable. So once again, I would just ask the question, why is there opposition to something that they say is not going to work? You know, we don't know if it's going to work or not. And with the possibility of 1.5 trillion barrels equivalent of oil, let's at least let that happen to see if that can be feasibly explored and developed and produced. We have nothing to lose. This is a great win for the American consumer, especially should a commercial application and scalable venture be produced. It would create energy and jobs and money for the Treasury. I urge strong opposition to this amendment. I have to disagree with my friend and colleague from Colorado on this particular issue, and I urge a no vote. Thank you, and I yield back.
All time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, on that I request the yeas and the nays.
The gentleman requests a recorded vote.
I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to deaths made in order under the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 6, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Hastings of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is essentially a technical manager's amendment making changes agreed to with the Armed Services Committee in order to ensure that we are fully respecting the needs of our nation's military. It adds further protections to those already included through the bill to ensure that energy production and our nation's national defense cooperatively exist in our nation's offshore areas. This amendment also includes a slight adjustment to the timing of the leasing of one offshore area off the coast of Alaska. In fact, it moves it back to 2015. So these have been talked with the minority. I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
I rise to strike the last word, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman.
Thank you.
Does the gentleman claim time in opposition?
Yeah, I claim the time of the minority.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. I will say that this amendment marginally improves the bill, but it does not change our fundamental opposition to it. But progress on any front is welcomed, even if we cannot make progress on every front. And so I'll be glad to yield.
I totally agree with you. Progress in any way is beneficial, so I appreciate the gentleman's accepting the bill or amendment.
So we do not oppose the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized. The gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The question is off the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 7, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mrs. Capps of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Capps, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is a straightforward amendment, and it is overwhelmingly supported by my constituents, so I hope we can all agree to it. The amendment strikes a harmful and unnecessary provision in the underlying bill that mandates new drilling in the sensitive waters off Santa Barbara and Ventura counties in California. The majority says this new drilling is necessary to help fund the transportation bill, but according to CBO, the new drilling, any new drilling off Southern California would at best generate tens of millions of dollars in revenue, while the gap in transportation funding is measured in the tens of billions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, leaving aside the specious funding arguments that the authors of the bill have made, the people most affected, my constituents, they don't want new drilling. My colleagues have heard me invoke Santa Barbara's devastating 1969 oil spill before, and that's because it galvanized Central Coast residents and virtually the whole state of California against more offshore drilling. We were outraged by the damage to the environment and the wildlife, to our economy, and we understood the havoc that similar blowouts would wreak upon our economy, especially tourism and fishing industries. And that's why California permanently banned new oil and gas leasing in state waters in 1994. It's why Californians fought to pass groundbreaking environmental laws like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Coastal Zone Management Act. It's why some 24 city and county governments, including both Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, have passed measures requiring voter approval before any new onshore facilities to support offshore drilling could be built. And that's why in 2008, then-Republican Governor Schwarzenegger told President Bush and Congress to oppose new drilling off the West Coast. More recently, an oil company in Santa Barbara thought it could capitalize on the high gasoline prices by placing a measure on the ballot to allow slant drilling from the shore. That plan was rejected by 70%, that's right, 70% of the voters in the community that was affected by it, Carpinteria, California, and that was just in 2010. We're also aware of the Pentagon's concern with new drilling in our area, so close to Vandenberg Air Force Base. In a 2008 letter to an oil company proposing to slant drill from the shore, the Air Force replied, and I have a copy of the letters to submit with my statement. This is a quote: "The drilling and production facility would present a wide range of significant operational constraints inconsistent with Vandenberg Air Force Base's National Space Launch mission." Mr. Chairman, Californians have spoken loud and clear. We do not want more drilling off our shores. We want to protect our coastline from the devastation that the 1969 oil spill brought to Santa Barbara. And now, because of this legislation, these communities are at risk again. It's not just the new drilling mandate in this bill, but also because the bill would gut critical environmental laws like CZMA and NEPA, the very laws passed in response to the 1969 spill off the Santa Barbara coast. It's outrageous. This bill specifically denies California and only California, any role in new offshore drilling decisions under the Coastal Zone Management Act. It also removes California citizens' ability to voice their concerns about new drilling during the environmental review process. I find it ironic that some of the same people in this body who decry an overarching federal government seem to have no qualms about forcing new drilling upon a local population which is directly against its wishes. This heavy-handed know-it-all approach rubber stamps destructive drilling, cuts out environmental reviews, and closes down the public's input. Might be good policy for oil companies, but it's bad policy for my constituents, and it's bad energy policy for our nation. So, Mr. Chairman, American families want us to pass a balanced transportation bill that creates jobs, fixes our roads and bridges, and ensures that they have a safe way to get to work and back home again. They don't want more politics, especially the kind that put our coasts, our communities, our very way of life at risk. So I urge my colleagues to join me in striking these harmful, unnecessary provisions from this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from California reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, according to the U.S. Census, the state of California's largest import is petroleum. Let me repeat that, Mr. Chairman. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the state of California's largest import is petroleum. So I guess it's a good thing that private geologists estimate that over 1.6 billion barrels of American-made energy are ready and waiting to be developed from existing infrastructure in Southern California. What does existing infrastructure mean? Well, there are currently about 23 oil and gas platforms located offshore Southern California, which account for about 24 million barrels of oil and 47 billion cubic feet of gas annually. The lease sale proposed in this legislation allows drilling from existing platforms, or, to put it in other vernacular, those that are already in place. If we are going to have a serious discussion about offshore drilling, it makes perfect sense to drill only where there is already drilling going on, but from where the petroleum already exists, which is why this bill specifically states no new infrastructure. We need to drill where there are known resources, and this California lease sale is a common-sense way to limit the drilling footprint while accessing our resources that are known in Southern California. In fact, Mr. Chairman, the state of California is already working with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on a permit to allow a company to drill from existing platforms in federal waters into state waters for state resources. Let me say, the state of California is entering into the same concept that's embodied in this bill. So let me repeat here one more time. It's Governor Brown's administration that is pursuing drilling off these same platforms in the coast. Additionally, this amendment completely eliminates all coastal states and U.S. territories from receiving fair and equitable income for drilling that would occur potentially off their shores. This means states like Florida and Virginia will not receive any portion of any revenues for drilling that will occur off their coasts under their bill if this amendment were to be adopted. This bill, the underlying bill, is a Drill Smart plan that directly focuses on those offshore areas where there are known resources, and that includes the vast resources of Southern California. This amendment would lock away significant resources that belong to the American people. It would keep our country shackled to the foreign powers upon whom we rely for foreign oil and gas imports. It would also hinder our nation's energy security. This amendment also ignores the soaring gas prices that American families are facing at the pump right now. And many of these families don't have room in their budget to pay for the hundreds of more dollars just to drive to work or drive their kids to school. And by the way, I might add, Mr. Chairman, I think if there's an epitome of an area in the country that does a lot of driving, it's in California. We need to get America producing energy again, and I urge my colleagues to vote and oppose this amendment and vote for the underlying legislation. And with that, I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentlelady from California is recognized. Gentlelady has 30 seconds remaining.
I'll just comment to remark that the very project that my colleague from Washington, my friend, described as the project that the local constituents rejected by 70%, the project that was mentioned. We are interested in California in ending drilling, not just stopping leasing, and I'll reserve the rest of my time to close.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Washington recognized.
Well, I would ask the gentlelady if she is prepared to close. I'm prepared to close. I have the right to close.
The gentleman from Washington has the right to close.
Mr. Chairman, our nation should be investing our time, our energy, and creativity into real solutions that put us toward the path toward clean energy solutions for our future. We've seen time and time again that our congressional district doesn't want to be known for chasing after yesterday's energy solutions, but for leadership toward the renewable energy solutions of today and tomorrow. I urge an aye vote for my amendment.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Washington has a minute and a half remaining.
Yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to reiterate once again, and this is understanding that people in our great country have different views, and I certainly understand what happened in Southern California some 40 years ago. Listen, that picture is indelibly in everybody's mind. But nobody can argue there has not been advances in oil exploration in this country and certainly in the OCS. But as a recognition of that, in this bill, we didn't say just go anywhere you want to go in Southern California. We said go to the existing platforms where you're drilling and existing infrastructure where there has been drilling. Now, that seems to me to be a perfectly acceptable way to utilize the resources that we have, by the way, in federal waters, not in state waters, in federal waters, so that we can make ourselves less dependent on foreign energy. And last thing I would say, the state of California is pursuing precisely the same thing that's embodied in this underlying bill, only on state waters. So I urge my colleagues to oppose my good friend's amendment from Southern California, and with that I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back, all time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The gentlelady from California, do you seek a recorded vote?
I seek a recorded vote.
The gentlelady from California seeks a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For purposes, gentlemen from Florida seek recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Bilirakis of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, and a member opposed each shall control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. With the national unemployment rate hovering around 8%, in my home state of Florida, its rate is close to 10%, there is no question that our nation is hurting for economic growth. This year, the focus of efforts here in the House of Representatives has centered on creating a framework for the private sector to innovate and grow, to create the jobs we desperately need. To that end, Mr. Chairman, my amendment seeks to take all prudent steps to ensure that jobs and the economy are the focus. My amendment simply requires the Secretary to conduct an economic impact survey to assess any effect lease sales would have on the Florida tourism and fishing industries. People from all over the world flock to the Gulf Coast of Florida specifically to visit our spectacular beaches, our parks, our waterways, and other recreational opportunities. More than 80 million tourists, Mr. Chairman, per year stay in our hotels, eat at our restaurants, and create many economic opportunities for Floridians. The tourism industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry for Florida and the national economy, Mr. Chairman. Florida's seafood and recreational fishing industries also contribute thousands of jobs and billions of dollars to the local economy. Mr. Chairman, I strongly urge this House to adopt a common-sense measure to ensure that the federal government consider all ramifications of lease sales and to ensure that the promotion of jobs and the economy remain the focus of any actions of our federal government. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. Purpose of the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition.
Yes, I rise to claim the time in the minority.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair very much.
Gentleman will suspend. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Just a point, the issue is not claiming time in minority or majority. The time is in opposition or, and if that is mine, I would rise to claim time in opposition, although I'm not opposed to the amendment.
The gentleman's correct. Is the gentleman from Massachusetts opposed?
There's no question that the gentleman from Washington State is correct. I'm a master of parliamentary rules, having stood up there or sat up there hundreds of hours. So he is an absolute correct dissector of language used here in seeking recognition from the chair. So I will rise to claim the time in opposition to the amendment. If that's, those are the technical words of art that the gentleman would prefer for me to use.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you. This amendment would require a study to investigate potential economic impacts from a variety of risks that oil development in the outer continental shelf poses to local tourism and fishing economies in Florida. Well, we actually had a real-world study for 87 days during the BP spill. As we saw in 2010 with the BP oil spill, oil can wreak havoc on a coastal community, meaning a disaster for tourism and fishing, seafood industries. These disasters can and do happen, putting hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars at stake. It is important for the public to know the risk associated with allowing oil companies to drill off of our coast, but we should be protecting our beaches in Florida, in California, in New Jersey, and Massachusetts, not just requiring a study of how huge a disaster a spill would be for these states. We should be protecting the lives and the livelihoods of the people of the Gulf by taking the lessons of the BP spill and turning them into new laws. But nearly 2 years after the BP spill began, this Congress has not enacted a single new law to improve the safety of offshore drilling. That is indefensible when the BP Commission found that we have a fatally flawed rate of accidents and fatalities in our country compared to the rest of the world. Ours is 4 times higher than that in Europe, that is the fatalities on our oil rigs. So that's the issue. We have yet to increase the fines because only we can do that here in Congress. Right now, a lot of these oil companies think it's just the equivalent of a parking ticket. You know, if you could pay a parking ticket for a whole day on the main street of any one of the cities in the United States, you'd pay that $1 parking ticket because it would be cheaper than paying $20 to put it in a garage. And that's what we have right now. We have the equivalent of $1 parking tickets that are assessed against oil companies who despoil the ocean, who result in, because of their faulty safety rules, the highest fatality rate in the world in terms of people who work on oil rigs. So at this point, I have completed my statement, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished Chairman, Mr. Hastings from Washington. Thank you.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman's amendment will conduct this economic impact study only for the Eastern Gulf of Mexico OCS planning area as defined in the bill. I understand and appreciate the gentleman's interest in protecting the multiple use of the OCS, and I join him in that interest. For decades, tourism, fishing, oil and gas drilling have been compatible in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's no reason that the new areas opened up under this bill would not operate in the same way. While I understand the interest of the gentleman to have this study for those areas in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, I wish that he could have expanded this study to jobs that could have been created by new drilling and the support that comes with that activity. And while that's not embodied in the gentleman's amendment, I would only have to think that because you're having a study on that, there may be some residual, and I would look forward to that residual potentially also. So I thank the gentleman, congratulate him for offering this amendment, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Yes, I'd like to close briefly, if that's all right. Of course, I urge passage of this reasonable, common sense amendment, and then I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 9, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Bishop of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop, and a member opposed each shall control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my amendment is very simple. It prohibits oil and natural gas lease sales off the coast of Northeast states, including New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. Furthermore, my amendment is paid for by striking language in the bill related to Outer Continental Shelf revenue sharing in Section 17501. I appreciate the Rules Committee making my amendment in order because this amendment will protect the coastline of New York and other Northeast states. I also thank my co-sponsors, including Mr. Crowley, Mr. Rangel, Mr. Pascrell, Mr. Capuano, and Ms. Pingree. Mr. Speaker, I represent the last 70 miles of eastern Long Island, where the primary industries are travel and tourism, everything to do with the second home market, agriculture, and the fishing industry. Thus, in my district, the environment is the economy in many respects. It can ill afford a disaster like Gulf Coast states endured during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. Oil-soaked beaches would devastate Long Island's economy, let alone the environment, and there is no reasonable person who can disagree with me on this point. The Republican drilling proposals to offset the highway bill would raise less than $4.3 billion over 10 years, according to CBO, or less than 1/10 of the revenue actually needed. Combine this with the other funding mechanisms for the highway bill, and Republicans are paying for their reckless legislation on the backs of middle-class families. For example, the Republican spending package will require federal employees to increase their pension contributions while reducing their benefits. Worse, as of this moment, they are using federal employees' pension contributions to offset costs in 2 completely separate proposals, the highway bill and the payroll tax cut package for unemployment benefits and the dock fix. This isn't being honest with the American people. I would ask the Republican leadership to check their numbers again. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support